8 Canadian environmental groups are demanding that Alberta Premier Jason Kenney retract statements and apologize for communications that they say are defamatory and directly contrary to the findings of the public inquiry into Alberta Energy Campaigns, commonly known as the Allen Inquiry. So I'm going to talk to Anna Johnston, who's a staff lawyer for West Coast Environmental Law, which is one of those groups. So welcome to the interview, Anna.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Well, look, lay out the case. What is it? What are you asking of the Premier?
So really, basically, we're asking for the Premier to retract misleading comments, misinformation that he has posted both on Government of Alberta website and then also in his social media around findings of the Allen inquiry, and to apologize for making those false claims to the public. And those claims are that the Allen inquiry found that environmental groups have waged a campaign of misinformation when in fact his very own commissioner found the exact opposite. The Allen inquiry report, of course, said that the commissioner didn't find that environmental groups had conducted any, misinformation campaigns or engaged in any kind of improper or illegal activities. So we're just asking for Premier Kenney to correct the record and apologize, and then we can all get back to the good work of, fighting climate change and protecting the environment.
Yeah, we should be really clear. The Allen Inquiry report bent over backwards to say that the groups that had received money from charities outside of Canada didn't do anything illegal, didn't spread misinformation. In short, didn't do any of the things that the Premier has said over the years that they did, that his cabinet ministers have said, his issues managers have said, and on and on. And it's odd that the Premier would make statements, and a number of statements on Twitter saying the exact opposite of what the inquiry, that this is quite extraordinary in a way.
Yeah, it's a huge problem for the environmental groups that have been targeted in this smear campaign. But I think even more fundamentally, it's a real problem for Albertans and for members of the public who are footing the bill, who foot the $3.5 million bill for this inquiry, just to have the Premier completely disregard the findings and to issue these statements that are totally contrary to what his own commissioner found.
Now, the Canadian press, when it did the story, reached out to Premier Kenney's spokesperson, who said, "We're not surprised that an organization which routinely pursues political activism through the courts is again threatening legal action. We will, of course, vigorously respond in court if and when necessary." So I guess the ball is now in the court of the environmental organizations. What's your next step?
Yeah, well, we have given Premier Kenney until, I believe it's next Tuesday, to respond. So we're hoping that maybe after some consultation with his lawyers and sober second thought, that he'll see the rationale for, correcting the record and issuing an apology. Of course, litigation is expensive, it is time consuming, it's exhausting. We really want to just get back to the work that we do. And so we're still hoping, not holding our breath, but hoping that calmer heads prevail and that we don't have to litigate. But if we don't get the results that we're looking for out of the letter, the apology and the correction of the record, then we'll have to regroup and figure out whether or not we actually do want to submit a claim in court and try to get some kind of an independent a judicial analysis of the situation and a court to ask Premier Kenney to take down those defamatory statements.
Now, I'm a little curious here because do previous statements, beyond the ones you're talking about, ones with the same kind of the same misleading information or flat out wrong information, is there a pattern of behavior here on the part of the Premier? And I'll give you the example I'm thinking of. Last year, Tides Canada changed its name to Makeway. The Premier came out and tweeted a couple of times of making really outrageous claims that were not true. I interviewed Joanna Kerr, the head of Makeway, and she said, not only are they not true, nobody from the Premier's office nor the Premier ever contacted us to verify the information that they put in those tweets. So there seems to be a pattern of behavior here. Should it go to court, might that play into a judge's perception or his or her legal finding?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there is a pattern of behavior. And because of that behavior, not only have environmental groups like West Coast and others, had to divert their energy and their resources away from, attempting to combat climate change to having to deal with the inquiry, and then also to push back against this misinformation. But yeah, I think when it comes to court, we do need to be really careful about framing the issue in a manageable way. We don't want multiple years and, tens, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars to go into a lawsuit. And so we might just decide to let sleeping dogs lie on some of the past stuff. And, it's really in when it comes to the most recent remarks around the Allen report, those are really easy for us to prove because we have this document, the Premier's own commissioner's document that states that no misinformation there was no campaign of misinformation, and then these completely contradictory statements. The Premier had to have read the report. I mean, it would be absurd and even potentially more alarming if the Premier didn't even read the report. So we can be reasonably assured that the Premier is aware that his statements were false and that he was deliberately defaming our organizations. And so, we will have to see whether or not we want to go to court, and if so, what we would be bringing up in that application. But likely we'd want to keep ourselves fairly focused on the issues that we think are the most relevant and the most pertinent right now.
And a final question. Let's talk about the harm that gets done, the practical consequences of harm to the reputations of these organizations. All of them are charities. All of them depend on donations from foundations, from individual donors, those sorts of things, to continue their operations. A damage to that reputation can affect their revenue. I think that's essentially your argument, is it?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of our arguments. On the reputational angle, I would also say that we work with a lot of other governments, provincial, federal, we work with officials. Those people are all humans. A lot of the work that we do really relies on good relationships. For example, I've spent years developing relationships with various officials in order to be seen as a trusted source of authority for the deep research and analysis that we do. And so, in addition to potentially loss of revenue, I think also just implementing the work that we do becomes a lot more difficult. For example, with community groups, when we're trying to help provide legal advice to people or working with local governments, and then again, the diversion of our resources and our time and energy, like we're in the middle of a climate crisis. British Columbia was on fire this summer and it's underwater now. We just can't afford to keep dithering around and to deal with these side issues. We have to get back to the good work of fighting climate change. And then I guess one other point that I would make, and potentially the most important, is that individuals within our organizations have been facing a significantly increased amount of death threats and threats of violence and rape towards them, and volunteers of our organizations, like at a really individual level. It's so problematic to have an elected representative and he has to know that inciting this kind of hatred and anger is going to result. We have documented, we have been public about the fact that this kind of rhetoric leads to threats of violence. And when you look south of the border, it's easy to understand the linkages there when elected representatives, make these kinds of inflammatory and false comments and pit members of the public, citizens, against each other. So, at a really human level, I think that impact just can't be underestimated.
Well, I can confirm that because I was the journalist who in 2019 published the debunking of Vivian Krause's foreign funded conspiracy narrative, and which in fact were the basis for the public inquiry we're talking about. And I can tell you that I have had, uncountable numbers of not death threats, but threats of violence and really awful trolling on social media, horrible things being said and untrue claims, lies and misrepresentations for my reputation. I mean, this seems to be, a standard operating procedure these days around this particular issue. Anyway, Anna, thank you very much. Really appreciate your insights on this.
Yeah, thanks very much for having me.